all, and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another dip into the archive. Today I'm looking at an attraction in Pinellas County on the Gulf Shore. It's one you may not know of since it closed 34 years ago. It was simply called Tiki Gardens and was a lush garden attraction with a tiki theme. It had an interesting history and played an unusual part in Florida's tourism history. It was located in the town of Indian Rocks Beach, though that would change to Indian Shores when part of the town split in 1973. Sitting on only 12 acres of land on a barrier island and along the intracoastal waterway, Tiki Gardens was a roadside attraction that might be mistaken for being off the beaten path. But when it was created, this area between Clearwater and St. Petersburg was already a popular spot with wintering snowbirds, summer vacation families, and many other travelers who wanted a day on the beach. As you might guess, Tiki Gardens fully embraced a tiki culture. What is tiki culture, you might ask? Well, it's the most popular type of exotic style to ever hit the U.S. While it started with borrowed cultural aspects from the South Pacific, it's a mishmash of styles that get thrown together over the years. If you've ever used tiki torches in your backyard, ever had a drink at a friend's tiki bar in their rec room, been to the enchanted tiki room at Disney World, or think you know how to sing Aloha Oi, you've touched on tiki culture. Based significantly on Polynesian culture, tiki actually comes from the Maori of New Zealand, an associated culture of the Polynesians. Tiki was the first man in Maori mythology, and the name was eventually adopted into tiki culture. The creation of it all began in California in the 1930s. First beginning with movies, which were telling tales from exotic places such as Hawaii, Tahiti, and Fiji, the look and feel of the South Pacific captured people's imagination. Eventually, restaurants were decorated in the style, even though few people knew much about it. Those restaurants gained popularity for being places that were both safe but unusual. Now, none of them served Polynesian food, by the way. It was Chinese food typically, and even that was heavily Americanized. World War II would end up introducing the actual South Seas to hundreds of thousands of American service personnel who came home with all sorts of souvenirs from places like Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. After the war came more movies, books, and in 1959, Hawaii statehood. The 50s and the 60s were the high point of tiki culture, though nobody called it that back then. Now, before we get to the story of Tiki Gardens, I want to note that the mishmash of styles when it comes to tiki culture, as well as the fact that plenty of it had to do with ancient religious and societal aspects of the people in the South Pacific, isn't exactly the best way to connect with a different culture. Tiki culture took all sorts of traditions and styles, Polynesian, Micronesian, Melanesian, Southeast Asian, Chinese, and even Caribbean, and dropped them in a blender to create an intoxicating drink that might be called the Isle of Tiki. The place where tiki bars, loud Hawaiian shirts, and the music of Martin Denny originate. Or, to put it in Floridian, it's like Jimmy Buffett's Margaritaville, a place that embraces the escape from reality we need without minding the details. But that means thousands of years of tradition and history are mostly ignored and replaced with hula dancers, coconut bras, ukulele and steel guitar music, and tiki god sculptures that are supposed to look like the ancient totems that appear throughout the Pacific Basin. And yes, totem is an Ojibwe term for a spirit being or spiritual object. Now, in this video, I'm talking about a tourist attraction that closed in 1990. I happen to love a number of things about tiki culture, but I regularly tell myself that it's good to remember who and what it all represents. Tiki Gardens began with Frank and Joe Byers, a married couple who met and fell in love in Tampa Bay area. Born in 1910 in Jonesville, South Carolina, Frank showed up in the Tampa area in the 1930s in his early 20s. Joe Miller Sneed was from Tennessee and was 3 years younger than Frank. They met and married in Tampa, and in 1935 their only child, Sherry Jo, was born. Frank managed a beach motel and Joe made jewelry out of seashells. They would focus on selling that jewelry and other gifts, and by the early 1950s they were able to purchase property in Indian Rocks Beach and open up a gift shop called the Signal House. In time, it became the biggest retail outlet in the area, consisting of several themed gift shops selling Oriental clothing, shells, baskets, driftwood, and other Florida tourist stuff. To that, they added a small garden path that had a Polynesian theme. This would be the start of Tiki Gardens. In 1951, their daughter, Sherry Jo, died as a result of cancer. She was just 16 and was the only child Frank and Joe would have. They established a scholarship in her name at nearby Eckerd College. It's for full-time undergraduates and continues to be awarded today. The Signal House shops were destroyed by fire in 1963, but Frank and Joe were able to rebuild, and this time their plan was to make a real attraction by enlarging the gardens and making the gift shops part of a complex that included a restaurant called Trader Frank's after its owner. Frank was quoted in the St. Petersburg Times in 1978 saying, "We'd always dreamed about the South Seas, so we researched it to see if there were any other attractions in the state with a Polynesian atmosphere. We found there were none." Now, arguably, that was correct. There wasn't an attraction with that theme, but for many years there was a huge restaurant and bar in Fort Lauderdale that was Polynesian themed. Known as the Mai Kai, it opened in 1956 and was the most expensive restaurant in the U.S. built that year. Developed by brothers Bob and Jack Thornton, the place cost $350,000 to build, but quickly earned that back. Within a year, it was not only the busiest restaurant in Florida, it was one of the busiest in America. It had 5 huge dining rooms and nearly doubled its size in the early 70s when it was expanded. While self-described as a Polynesian restaurant, it offered Cantonese dishes from southern China like other tiki restaurants did. The Mai Kai has remained successful and you can still visit it today. It's one of the oldest restaurants in the state as its 70th anniversary is in a couple years. When it was built, it was described by one of the owners as being in the middle of nowhere on US 1. But it was successful, and today few things have changed. The decor is the same, the servers still dress in sarongs, the nightly entertainment is wonderful, and then there's the mystery bowl ritual. I recommend checking that out if you go. But let's get back to Tiki Gardens. Yes, Frank and Joe didn't see much in the way of Polynesia in Florida, but really that probably wasn't much of a surprise. The southern half of the state is semi-tropical with beautiful trees, romantic flowers, and exotic birds all around, so recreating the look and feel of the South Pacific wouldn't have been an idea on most people's minds. We already had botanical gardens like McKee Jungle Gardens, Sarasota Jungle Gardens, Caribbean Gardens, and the nearby Sunken Gardens. Frank and Joe decided to go with the theme, but they didn't do it the way the Mai Kai was created. That had a well-known architectural firm design the building, which had what would become the classic American Polynesian look. It was the first major building in the state that had a style that could be termed Polynesian exotic. On the other hand, Frank and Joe couldn't find an architect to design what they wanted, so they just hired a builder, and as Frank said, "We bought some brown wrapping paper, and every morning Joe would draw the pictures on the paper, and the builders would build from that. We built the whole thing that way." As for the gardens, local designers, landscape architects, and horticulturalists worked the land and added plants along a winding path that Frank and Joe laid out. It was known as the Polynesian Adventure Trail. Unlike most gardens, which encourage guests to wander and explore while getting a bit lost in the greenery, Tiki Gardens was designed to be a one-way path. Frank and Joe wanted people to follow the trail and be directed to the shops and restaurant. The gardens, which only encompassed some 4 acres, had a number of parts with bridges, ponds, bird and monkey cages, waterfalls, and Polynesian-style buildings. The most dramatic features were the giant tiki god sculptures designed by Gordon Keith. While they appeared to be carved in stone, they were crafted of stucco on a frame of wood and chicken wire. The tikis were scattered along the path, with some available even for camera shots with the family. Tiki Gardens opened to the public in 1964. Out on Gulf Boulevard was Tiki Gardens shops. The main building was topped with a trio of high-pitched roofs, reminiscent of some of the early structures in Polynesia. The entrance led into the middle of the building and into an expansive lobby. Along the sides were the Papa Tiki shop of menswear and the Boutique, which had handbags, wallets, and other accessories. The two other parts of the building housed the Polynesian shops for ladies' wear and the Oriental shop. It was filled with Asian gifts, including items from China and Japan. There you could find items crafted from jade, brass, porcelain, stone, wood, and even ivory, at least up until the mid-70s. Behind the main building was a smaller one that housed a basket and furniture mart. It was said to have contained the largest collection of baskets in Florida. There was also a treasure house for fine jewelry, the Tahiti hut that focused on actual Polynesian gifts, and a Christmas shop filled with, well, you can probably figure that out. The ninth store was the Lotus House, which sold gourmet foods from around the world. Trader Frank's restaurant could seat 450 and included the Wiki Wiki Lounge. The building sat behind the shops at the end of the Black Lagoon. In reality, one of two short canals dredged to add water features to the gardens. The restaurant was richly decorated with bright colors, rattan tables, fishing nets, interesting art, and bananas hanging from ferns. Unlike Mai Kai, Frank's didn't have a show, but it did have Ernie Shreves on the keyboard most evenings. By day, he was a home builder. Unlike many Polynesian restaurants, the menu wasn't exclusively Chinese. It adopted recipes from various parts of the Pacific, including China, Japan, Hawaii, and Tahiti, though the recipes weren't terribly authentic. Starting near the entrance to Trader Frank's, the Polynesian Adventure Trail only cost visitors a small admission fee. Initially, the charge was $1.25 for adults and 50 cents for kids. It remained inexpensive throughout 26 years of operation, with this coupon showing the 1980 cost had only increased to $2 for adults. That'd be only $8 today. The gardens had a number of peafowl wandering around the grounds, one of the common non-native birds that are still a fixture of a number of Florida attractions today. The gardens were also the site of the nightly torch lighting ceremony. The first part of the trail was along the Black Lagoon through the mangroves on a boardwalk somewhat similar to the current one at nearby Weedon Island Preserve. Near the Intracoastal Waterway was a bridge that led to a Maori burial ground. Remember, the Maori are the indigenous islanders that first colonized New Zealand. Then you passed a hukalau shack, essentially a Hawaiian fishing shack, as hukalau comes from huki, meaning pole, and lau, meaning leaves. To fish, family and friends would cast a large net from shore and then pull it back. The net was lined with leaves to scare fish into the center. The next part was Fire Mountain, a mound made from the rubble dredged from the canals. And then the first statue called Ku, a Hawaiian god. Traditionally, he represented war, fishing, and farming, and was called by many names, my favorite being Kuwahailo, or Ku of the maggot-dropping mouth, who represented sorcery. He led to the Sun Temple of Kon-Tiki. This is a bit confusing, as Tiki Gardens says he's the Polynesian sun god, but in reality he's thought to be an alternate name of the South American Inca creator god Viracocha, and he was used by Thor Heyerdahl as the name of the reed raft he built and piloted from South America to Polynesia in 1947. His theory was that the Polynesians were originally from the continent, a concept that has been proven incorrect. Frank and Joe probably learned the name from Heyerdahl's trip. Nearby to the temple was the Garden Chapel, described as a replica of an island chapel of Hawaiian queens still in use in Hawaii. Christianity first took hold in Hawaii after 1819 when missionaries began to actively convert the population. On the other side of the path were several bird cages leading to the crossroads that passed the Parakeet Bell Tower. The tower was about 30 foot tall and featured a whole lot of parakeets. By the way, parakeets, peafowl, doves, and the other birds of Tiki Gardens aren't native to Polynesia. From there, the trail led back to the water and across the second bridge and onto the island section of the adventure trail. This might have been where the visitors first met the famous Paco, a red macaw, today more commonly known as the scarlet macaw. Scarlets are originally from South and Central America, but Paco was likely from Parrot Jungle in Miami. On the islands, one could see Lono, a Hawaiian god that is associated with fertility, agriculture, rainfall, music, and peace, as well as Aku Aku. Aku Aku are associated with Easter Island or Rapa Nui, and are spirits of the dead, who were thought by Rapa Nui's settlers to have arrived with their ancestors, and initially they were known to be cannibalistic. Later, they were known to live off the aroma of cooked meals and helped in household chores. Much nicer. Once past the islands, the animals become a number of monkey species and the monkey god statue. Once again, there aren't any monkeys in Polynesia. Guests then reach Tiki Lagoon. This statue is titled Oro, two-faced wind god, but there doesn't appear to be any direct connection in a Polynesian deity. On the other hand, there is Oro, a god of war in Tahiti and the Society Islands, so maybe that's the source. Finally, we reach Kahona, a water god. Once again, it's unclear as to the source of this, and the word is not really Polynesian. Hawaii does have a Kanaloa, an ocean god, which is also associated with seafaring, the underworld, and magic. Regardless, Kahona was where the torch lighting ceremony often took place. Frank and Joe's first decade was during the time when Tiki culture was at the peak of its popularity. This was when jets became common enough that the middle class could afford to fly. The Boeing 747 airliner was introduced in 1970, and it was that same year Pan Am began flying them to Hawaii. I was lucky enough to take one of them there just 2 years later. 1968 saw the premiere of Hawaii Five-0, a long-running police drama that was filmed in many of the places tourists visited. The South Pacific had fully captured the imagination of most Americans. Tiki Gardens would be one of the many Polynesian-themed places around the country. There were even several more in Florida. Opened in the same year, Cape Coral Gardens featured the Aloha Lagoon, which had its share of tiki gods and was lit by tiki torches at night. It was billed as a quiet and romantic part of the attraction. There was also a lesser-known Polynesian restaurant in Jensen Beach near Stewart. Owned by movie and TV star Francis Langford, the Outrigger Resort opened in 1961 and also had several rental cottages and a marina. Orlando would be the site for 2 more. Disney World opened in 1971 and included the Adventureland area in the Magic Kingdom. One of its attractions was the Tropical Serenade, better known as the Enchanted Tiki Room. It also had tiki gods, even ones that performed in the show. Then there was nearby SeaWorld. It opened just a year after Disney and featured an area called Hawaiian Village. It had shops and a restaurant, the Hawaiian Punch Pavilion. By the early 1980s, Tiki culture was nearly at the end of its popularity, and it appears that Tiki Gardens wasn't as busy as it once was.
Now, some suggest it has to do with the arrival of Disney World, but Tiki Gardens was never really a destination attraction like Silver Springs or Cypress Gardens. Its popularity was tied to the nearby Gulf. Beachgoers, both those who came for the day or who were staying in one of the many nearby hotels, were the ones who ate at the Signal House, shopped for gifts, and walked the gardens. Tiki Gardens was fairly Disney-proof. No, it's more likely that the attraction became dated. Tiki culture had lost its exotic allure and ironically had become old-fashioned. Along with that, the property began to look a bit dated. Buildings, bridges, and even tiki gods created 20 years before were looking rather long in the tooth, as it were. And the reality was that by the late 80s, Frank and Joe were getting tired of managing. In 1987, Frank was 77 and Joe 74. They didn't have kids to pass the business on to, and so they decided to sell. In that same year, Frank was quoted as saying, "We think of Tiki Gardens as the place to dream a while. All of the other attractions emphasize excitement. Here, people can think about the things that have happened to them and those that might happen." They accepted an offer of nearly $3 million from Australian investors in 1988. The sale supposedly included about $2 million worth of black opals. The new owners kept the place running for only 2 more years until it was sold again, this time to Pinellas County, yet again for $3 million. The county auctioned off what they could and demolished the rest. They allowed the mangroves to take over and turned the rest into a parking lot. Yes, in the words of Joni Mitchell, they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Still, it's just about the only beach access public parking in Indian Shores, and at $2.50 an hour, the 168 parking spaces can generate about $6,000 a day. It earns about $1 million a year. It also has a history feature that was added to the north end of the park fairly recently, one that tells the story of the area's early inhabitants, the Tocobaga tribe. Interestingly, the former site of Tiki Gardens is now teaching about the actual history of an indigenous culture, and one that's local, not from 6,000 miles away.
After they sold Tiki Gardens, Frank and Joe went into semi-retirement, though they owned the Fun and Sun Shop at John's Pass Village, just 6 miles south of Tiki Gardens. They continued to live in Redington Beach and spent summers in North Carolina. Joe died in 1994 in North Carolina, while Frank died a year later. Both were buried in Florida, in Largo, in their family plot next to their daughter Sherry Joe and Joe's mom, Melanda Sneed. Tiki Gardens closed in 1990. It ran for 26 years, and 2024 is its 60th anniversary. I'm always unsure as to whether an attraction should continue to exist or not. Certainly, I miss Tiki Gardens. Even in Florida, the home of so many tourist attractions, it was unique. No other attraction embraced tiki culture in the same way. While it wasn't authentic, it never took itself too seriously. Tiki Gardens never claimed to be a museum, and no matter what people think about them, Florida's attractions have always been more about fantasy than reality. And then there's the story of Frank and Joe, a lifelong couple. And while they began their attraction later than some, they are certainly part of the family of Florida attraction developers that includes Dick and Louise Pope of Cypress Gardens, Newt Perry of Weeki Wachee, France and Louise Scher of Parrot Jungle, and Ross Allen of the Silver Springs Reptile Institute. Thank you for watching another of my videos. I hope you enjoyed it. If you learned something, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more about Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom, Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.